And let's get started. This is Larry Hatcher of the Psych Department at SVSU. This is my lecture on Jean Piaget's Theory of Cognitive Development, lecture that I would normally give on Tuesday, March 17 in my Tuesday-Thursday Psych 100 class. Same lecture would be given on Wednesday, March 18 in my Monday-Wednesday class. So if you're in the Monday-Wednesday class, you can watch this video as well. It gives exactly the same notes that I would be giving in that class. Hopefully you've received an email from me that indicated where you can find the file that you'll need to follow along with this video. Hopefully you have that document in front of you, and as we go through my lecture you can fill in the blanks on that document and you'll have complete lecture notes to get you ready for anything that I might ask regarding Piaget in the lecture portion of our upcoming test. Let's move down to the outline. Here's a modified version of the outline that I had shown in a previous lecture. My previous outline was more ambitious than this, given the amount of time that I've had to spend on the mechanics of learning how to get my course online. I have not been able to lecture on as many topics as I had hoped to lecture on. With the modified outline, today I'll be lecturing on the final lecture topic that you'll be tested on for test number 3. Final lecture topic is this: Piaget's theory of cognitive development. If you compare this outline to the outline I showed you in the previous video, you can see that I've had to lop off a couple of the topics. Piaget is the last thing that I'm going to lecture on in the current unit. And lecture notes begin here. Here's my outline for today's lecture: Piaget's theory of cognitive development. I'm going to go over the basic concepts in Piaget's theory. Why is it that his theory is considered so important in psychology and education and other fields? I'll spend most of my time talking about the 4 stages of cognitive development according to Piaget's theory, and wrap up by talking about some of the criticisms of Piaget's theory. Let's begin with basic concepts. Basic concepts. Piaget's theory is a theory of cognitive development. You'll remember the word cognition means thinking. So Piaget's theory is a theory of how thinking changes as we develop. Piaget argues that children and adolescents progress through predictable, distinct stages as they grow up. And you can see that's our first fill in the blank for the current lecture. Anytime you see something highlighted in yellow on my screen, that means there's a corresponding blank on the document in front of you, and you need to fill in that corresponding blank. Children and adolescents progress through distinct stages. Piaget suggests that we go through 4 separate stages of cognitive development, and the way that we think about the world is qualitatively different in each of these stages. It's not just the question of us becoming more intelligent as we get older. Piaget acknowledges that, but he says there's more to it than just getting more intelligent. He says that qualitatively, the way that we think about the world is different as we move through these 4 stages. I have as an example here egocentricity. I'm going to talk about egocentricity a little bit later in the lecture. I give you a definition for it at that time. Short definition is that if you're showing egocentric thinking, if you're displaying egocentricity, it is very difficult for you to see things from someone else's perspective. When we're very young, this is characteristic of our thinking. Very young children are unable to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else and see things from the perspective of that other individual. As we get older, we move into a more sophisticated stage of cognition where we're no longer limited by egocentric thinking. We're capable of other ways of thinking. We grow out of that egocentric stage. That's what I mean when I say that Piaget argues that we go through qualitatively distinct stages of cognition as we become more sophisticated. And yes, we'll go into the details of those stages that we go through. We begin with stage 1, sensory motor stage. we go through the sensory motor stage from birth through approximately second year of life. You may be wondering, do I need to memorize these years? If you're a student in my class, the answer is no. You don't need to memorize the specific ages. I do expect you to remember the sequence in which we go through these stages. Which stage is the first stage, sensory motor stage, as you can see. What's the second stage we go through? What's the third stage? You don't need to remember the months and years that are associated with these ages, but I do want you to remember the sequence. Stage 1, sensory motor stage. You're going to notice that these stages have kind of peculiar names. So let me give you some tips on how to remember what this stage is all about. Sensory motor stage is all about sensation, which is what sensory pertains to. Motor refers to movement, using the muscles. Think about a very young child. They're all about being able to think about only those things that are in immediate sensory contact. They're able to think about those things that they can touch and hold and grab with their hands. That's why it's called sensory motor stage. Thinking is largely limited to what we can sense and what we can manipulate with our hands. Approximately birth through the second year of life. It's during this stage that we first develop the milestone of object permanence. Object permanence I define as the concept that things continue to exist even when out of sight. Piaget argued that we show the first signs of object permanence somewhere around 8 to 12 months of life. Now, object permanence is a difficult concept for us adults to relate to because we've had object permanence for so long we take it for granted. Right now, if I were to ask you, do you own a car? You might say, yes, I do own a car. I ask, where's your car parked? And you say it's parked out in F lot right now. This shows that you have object permanence. You realize that something continues to exist even when you can't see it, even when you can't touch it. Piaget argued that very early in the sensory motor stage, infants don't have a sense of object permanence. If they can't see something, if they can't touch something, they don't know that it exists. If it's out of their sight, it's completely out of their mind. This is early in stage 1. They do develop object permanence a little bit later in stage 1. I've got a graphic here that illustrates the concept of object permanence. Here we have a very young infant. Notice it's playing with a stuffed animal. I believe it's a stuffed puppy dog, isn't it? Enjoying playing with it. Imagine you took that stuffed animal, pulled it away from the child, pulled it about a foot away so the child can't reach it. You put a white poster board in between the child and the stuffed animal. If it's a very young child, chances are good that the child won't cry for the animal, won't reach for the animal. The reason it doesn't protest is because it doesn't know that the animal still exists. A very young child doesn't have a sense of object permanence. Now, as they age, as they get older, around 8 months of age, 9 months of age, 10 months of age, they develop a sense of object permanence. When they have that, then they'll know that the object still exists even though they can't see it, even though they can't touch it. You take an older infant that's playing with the stuffed animal, take the animal away from the child, put a white poster board between the child and the animal, and the older infant will cry for the animal, will continue to reach for it, because the older child understands that the animal still exists even though can't see or touch the animal right then. If that's the way the child responds, that means by definition the child has developed a sense of object permanence. Early in stage 1, they don't have object permanence. Around 8 to 12 months, they develop a sense of object permanence, according to Piaget. For what it's worth, today's psychologists argue that Piaget got this a little bit wrong. Today, most psychologists believe they do develop a sense of object permanence a bit younger than this. It doesn't matter much from your perspective. If you're a student in my class, you don't need to memorize these ages, but I do expect you to remember that early in stage 1, they don't have object permanence. Later in stage 1, they do. That is stage 1, sensory motor stage. We move up a stage to stage 2. Pre-operational stage. Most of us are in the pre-operational stage around 2 to 7, ages 2 to 7. What are some of the big developments? What are some big characteristics of the pre-operational stage? It's during this stage that we start using mental representations and language to reason about the world, but we do so in an egocentric fashion. Now, there's major cognitive developments in the pre-operational stage. One of the big ones is this: language. We're able to say words that represent things that we don't necessarily have in front of us. A parent says something to a child about toy stuffed animal, and the child understands what the parent is talking about, even though that toy stuffed animal is not nearby. That means the child is now using mental representations and language to reason about the world. That is a major development. But during stage 2, we operate under a cognitive limitation. The reasoning that we display early in stage 2 is egocentric reasoning. Egocentrism, that's something that I mentioned a bit earlier in the lecture. Let's go ahead and define it now. Egocentrism is an inability to see things from another's point of view. You've got a blank on your page there. You should fill that in. Egocentrism, inability to see things from another's point of view. Take a very young child and ask the child, what kind of present should we get for mommy for Christmas this holiday season? Young child might say, if it's a little boy, might say, we should get G.I. Joe for mommy. From the kid's perspective, G.I. Joe is a toy that he would very much enjoy getting himself. He's unable to see that mommy probably wouldn't get a lot of pleasure out of that G.I. Joe toy. This child is displaying egocentric thinking. You can see this in even very concrete terms. Psychologists will sit across a table from a child, arranges blocks in a certain order in front of her, gives a set of similar blocks to the child, and says, I want you to arrange your blocks the way that my blocks are arranged, but I want you to arrange them so that they look to you the way that my blocks look to me. A young child would have great difficulty doing this. A young child finds it difficult to imagine what the blocks would look like from the psychologist's perspective, the psychologist that's sitting across the stage, sitting across the table from the child. The child is displaying egocentrism, something that we associate with stage 2, the pre-operational stage. We move up a stage. Child becomes more sophisticated. We're in stage 3 now, the stage of concrete operations, approximately ages 7 through 11. Think of a child in late grade school, early middle school. That's the ages around which they are in the stage of concrete operations. When they're in this stage, they become skilled at solving concrete and tangible problems, but only if it's a concrete and tangible problem. Their thinking is largely limited to concrete matters. They do display more logical thinking, but only with respect to concrete, tangible problems. I always illustrate this by talking about the conservation task involving clay that Piaget would use to demonstrate that a child is at the stage of concrete operations. I describe this to you and think about how this shows that the child is not very good at solving problems unless they're of a concrete nature, and even concrete problems can be challenging to them early in this stage. For example, conservation task is something that most kids master by the time they're late in this stage, around age 11, but not early in this stage. For example, let's imagine we have a 7-year-old child. This is a child that's early in the stage of concrete operations. Imagine that I hold a ball of clay in front of the child. Ball of clay has been rolled so that it's a sphere, it's a ball. I hold the clay in front of the child and I say, notice how much clay I have in front of me. Notice the amount of clay. Watch what I'm about to do to it. I take the ball of clay and I roll it out so it's thin, it's sausage shaped now. And I ask the child, is there more clay now? Is there less clay now? Or is there the same amount? A young child that's early in this stage, a 7-year-old, might say, there's more clay now. Well, how do you know? Because it's longer than it was before. Now, that's an incorrect response. This child is not very good at the conservation task. By the same token, another child that's early in this stage, a 7-year-old, might say, there's less clay now. Well, how do you know? Well, it's skinnier than it was before. Another child says, there's more clay now. How do you know? Well, it's longer than it was before. All of those are incorrect responses. You take an older child, a child that's 11 years old, later in this stage of concrete operations, they'll start giving the correct response. Correct response is, well, it's the same amount of clay. How do you know? Well, you didn't add anything to it, you didn't take anything away, so it's got to be the same amount. This is a child that has developed a sense of conservation. This is a child that is good at solving problems, but in this stage, they're only good at solving problems when those problems involve concrete, tangible matters, such as some physical object I can hold in front of the child. If this child is in stage 3, the stage of concrete operations, there are some kind of tasks that they're not very good at. A child that's in stage 3, stage of concrete operations, is typically poor at solving abstract theoretical problems. For example, here's a question you would probably not want to ask of a child that's early in this stage. What would have happened in U.S. history and popular culture if the United States had never gotten involved in the war in Vietnam? A child that's in the stage of concrete operations would have difficulty answering a question like that because it's abstract, it's theoretical. It's difficult for them to imagine this theoretical parallel universe where we never went into Vietnam. Have difficulty with it because they are in stage 3, stage of concrete operations. To be able to answer a question like that, need to move to our more advanced stage of development. Stage 4, stage of formal operations. This is the stage that everybody listening to this video is presumably at. We first enter stage 4, stage of formal operations, somewhere around the ages of 11 to 15. This is when we enter this stage. It's not like you enter it at 11, you exit it at 15. Once you're in the stage of formal operations, you remain there for the rest of your life. Stage 4, stage of formal operations, first display signs of this around 11 to 15. What are the characteristics of formal operations? When we're in this stage, we're now capable of abstract thought. There's another blank that you need to fill in, abstract. When you're in the stage of formal operations, you can consider possibilities as well as realities. You can develop and test mental hypotheses. A child that's in this stage, you could ask them the question, what would have happened in U.S. history and popular culture if we had never entered the war in Vietnam? They're able to imagine the direction that our culture would have gone in if we hadn't been entangled in that war. They could take a stab at answering an essay question like that. They are capable of formal operations. When a child is in the stage of formal operations, this leads to good things and it also leads to some challenging things. Being in the stage of formal operations can lead to less pleasant experiences, things like challenging parents for the first serious time in your life. When you're a young child, your parents tell you to go to bed at 9 p.m. You may be inclined to do what they say. But now you're in formal operations. They tell you to go to bed at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or whatever. You're able to come up with 3 separate arguments as to why you should not be required to do this. Theoretically, a child could get by on not very much sleep and still do fine in school. You know of all kinds of kids in your school that go to bed at 11 or 12 or 1 o'clock and they're doing fine. You come up with other theoretical reasons why it should be an okay thing. Another semi-unpleasant thing the child experiences for the first time when they're in formal operations is their first identity crisis. Maybe when you were a child for much of your life, you had a fixed idea of who you were going to be as an adult. You decided, I'm going to be a football player, or you decided, I'm going to be a nurse or something like that. Now you're in formal operations and you recognize theoretically there's all kinds of different things that I could be. There's all kinds of different identities I could assume. Maybe I want to be a school teacher instead. Maybe I want to be somebody that takes care of people's lawns instead. Maybe I want to go off and be a nun or a priest or something. These possibilities come to you because you're able to think of hypothetical worlds in addition to the actual concrete world that you've lived most of your life in. So being capable of abstract thought, being capable of hypothetical thinking, being capable of formal operations will introduce you to your first identity crisis. It's not the only identity crisis you'll experience in life, but most of us experience it the first time as an adolescent, and that's no accident. It's because when we're an adolescent, we enter stage 4, the stage of formal operations. Jean Piaget's theory has been super influential. You will read about it in psychology textbooks. You'll read about it in education textbooks and other disciplines as well. It's been very influential. Anytime theory is that influential, it puts kind of bullseye on it and opens itself up for scrutiny and therefore criticism. Among criticisms that you'll hear when it comes to Jean Piaget's theory are things like this. His apparent assumption that we go through distinct stages. Now, Piaget doesn't come out and say it this way exactly, but a superficial reading of his theory gives you the impression that he seems to think that we're in stage 1, sensory motor stage, and this is the way that we think about the world, and this is the only way that we think about the world for some period of time, and then suddenly, bang, we're up in stage 2. We're thinking about the world in a qualitatively totally different way. We do that for some period of time, and then bang, we're in stage 3. We think about the world in yet another qualitatively different way. Folks that conduct research with children say that development isn't really like that. Development tends to be more gradual with teeny little steps. They talk about children will show reversals. They'll show one level of cognitive ability and then will backslide for a bit before they continue progressing and growing intellectually. A lot of folks question his apparent assumption that we go through distinct stages, with each stage being qualitatively dramatically different from the preceding stage and the following stage. That's criticism 1. Criticism number 2 focuses on Piaget's thought about very young children. Piaget's assumption that young infants understand little about the world. Piaget seemed to think that young infants weren't able to think about much beyond what they could see and touch and feel with their hands. Today, a lot of researchers believe that even young infants are more aware than that. They have cognitive abilities a little bit more sophisticated than Piaget seemed to think. I'm not sure if this is a terribly serious criticism of Piaget and his work. Today's psychologists have access to research technology that Piaget could not have imagined when he was doing his work decades and decades ago. Today, psychologists generally view young infants as being a little bit more cognitively sophisticated than Piaget did. Maybe that's because today researchers have access to research technology superior to what Piaget had access to back in the day. But anyhow, that's one of the criticisms of Jean Piaget, his apparent assumption that young infants understand little about the world. There's a blank that I hope you have filled in. And that is the end of the lecture for today's class meeting. Watch your email for announcements from me concerning future lecture videos. I'm not sure that I'm going to record any more videos for Unit 3. I think I lean in the direction of probably no. I do plan to have some kind of a review session available for you folks, some kind of online review session using one of the tools in Canvas. Do keep an eye out for emails from me. If we're going to have an online review session, I'll indicate when it's going to be and what you need to do in order to participate in that online review session. At any rate, if you have questions, feel free to contact me by email, and keep an eye out for emails from me, and I'll talk about our next step.